Greetings, attendees. We will be starting at 4:05. Again, greetings. We will be starting at 4:05 p.m. Thank you. Greetings of solidarity to our participants and our Indigenous brothers and sisters around the world. I am Prince Rutogo, Philippine Coordinator of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International. We would like to recognize hundreds of organizations that registered from different parts of the globe, from the Philippines, Germany, United States of America, Canada, Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Denmark, and Australia. We would also like to recognize our participants from student publications, journalism organizations, and TV networks present. Feel free to use the chat box feature to introduce yourself and your organization so that we could welcome you. You may also use the question and answer feature if you have inquiries, which will be answered by our speakers after the presentation. IPRI will also be sending a link of calls in the chat box, which we will be using at the closing session for our symbolic action. Kindly download the calls and post them on social media at the end of the session. We're live now on Facebook, so kindly share the link to your friends and groups. You may also use the hashtags #FreeLumiBaw4, #DefendTheAetas, and #JunkTerrorLaw when you post or tweet on different social media sites. The Indigenous Peoples Rights International is a legally registered nonprofit global indigenous peoples organization that works to protect indigenous peoples' rights and unite and amplify the call for justice to victims of criminalization and impunity. Our works are based in countries with a high incidence of attacks against the indigenous peoples, such as Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, Philippines, India, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Kenya. The Aetas of Central Luzon live simple lives. For them, land is life. That's why they are engaged in collective farming and living. Despite the rich natural resources in their lands, the Aitas, along with all other indigenous groups in the country, remain in the poorest sector of society. They are victims not only of calamities, but also of social inequalities and injustice. On August 21, 2020, an Aita community at the mountainous part of Barangay Buhawen, San Marcelino, Zambales was reportedly bombed during a military operation. More than 600 indigenous Aetas were forced to evacuate their ancestral lands. Worse, two indigenous Aetas are the first persons known to be charged under the controversial Republic Act 11479 or the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. Before we begin with our speaker, we will be watching a video of Jepoy Gerung. He was accused of being a member of the New People's Army together with three others, two of which were minors. Aside from the trumped-up charges filed against him, including illegal possession of firearms and ammunition, illegal possession of explosives, he is also the first publicly charged individual of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. For our viewers, trigger warning, the interview of Jepoy Gerung contains explicit description of the events. For participants, you may stop watching the video if it negatively affects your well-being in any way. Thank you.
Ano nang apon, bisa-bisa din. Manood kayo ng ano sa cellphone. Pinauurin yung mga kasama na yung mga babae. Pagkatapos kanya-kanyang pwesto na. Tinali na po kami. Pagkatapos pinapaamin po. Ako po yung unang tinali. Pagkatapos po ganito kalaki yung plastic na nilalagay dito sa ulo. Ginaganon po yung sigaryo. Pagkatapos ilagay po yung plastic. Pagkatapos sigurong oras po bago nila tanggalin yung plastic po ilagay nila po sa ulo ko. Pagkatapos sabihin sa akin, magtapat ka na. Alam ko, ikaw yung mataas dito. Dahil hindi po kayo, patayin niyo po ako, wala po kung alam dyan. O, bakit hindi ka marunong mag-Ilocano? Bakit yung mga bayaw sa kabiyana mo marunong silang mag-Ilocano? Sabi ko, hindi po ako daka rito, pangga po ako. Ay, dayo ka lang dito. Tinuturo ko din yung misis ko. Sabi nila sa akin, hindi ko daw misis. Ay, hindi na misis ito. Hindi siya asawa. Sabi ko, kahit sabihin niyo sa akin, talagang asawa ko po yan. Kaya napunta lang ako dito. Dahil misis ko yung nandito. Mga biyanan ko. At tapos nung ginawa nila po sa akin, natapos po akong nalagyan ng plastic. Sila na naman dalawa yung biyanan ko, pati yung bayo ko. Iiwalay na kami, hindi ko rin sila makita kung anong gagawin sa kanila. Pagkatapos ng isang gabi din magdamag na hindi naman pinaturog. Anong ginawa ko sa kanila? Nakatali ko sa likod yung tali na huli, yung tali, yung pagduyan na tali, yung kaso na hindi na, nung bago po dinala kami dito po, ang wala. Ayan po yung tinanggaling ng mga tali. At ito, alos sabihin nila para magtapat daw ako, yun ang ginawa nila po. Pagkatapos ko nung ginawa nila sa kanya-kanya po nung umaga na po, tinanggal na naman po yung tali namin. Tapos pinakain kami. Hindi yung ganyan na oras po. Balisyam kami. At isang bata na ganyan, saka dalawang bata na maliit na babae, saka isang matanda na diyanan ko. At yung ganyan diyanan ko, pati yung bayo ko. Balisyam kami. Pinapasita pa namin yung isang ano nang gano'n na isa ama ba. Gusto pa iampas sa amin eh. Kaya hindi naman totoo yung, hindi naman kayo nagtatanim, ikaw MPA ka rito talaga. Sabi ko, hindi po ako talaga. Dati MPA ako pero nagbagong buhay na ako, sabi ko sa kanila, pero hindi. Talagang sinasaktan ako talaga. Nung hapon yung ganyan oras, kanya-kanya na po kami, iwalay na po yung lagyan na po ng tali. 6 na araw namin sa ano eh. Kung saan nila kami.
Hindi mo alam kung saan ka dinala.
Ito po yung ebidensya po namin sa ebidensya rin po namin sa pinantali nila po sa akin ng hindi ko na pinaaram po. Tapos yung ginawa nila, hindi tatlo kami, pati yung biyanan ko, pati yung bayo ko. Tatlo kami. Ginala po kami dito sa mismong sapa. Ginawa. Dahil hindi ka magtapat, uuwi na namin patayin yung biyanan mo. Ginala po sa ganyang maray, pinaputukan yung biyanan ko. Tignan mo patayin na yung biyanan din, narinig yung putok.
Ay, nakapitik kayo.
Oo, nakaganon po ako. Puro nakapiling, nakaganon po.
Narinig nilang putok.
Hindi narinig yung putok. Patay na yung biyanan mo. ikaw dapat magsalita ka na, ipakita mo na yung baril mo. Pero po wala po akong alam kahit patayin ko sa ganitong katawan ko po. Mayroon ba akong maawakan na baril sa'yo ko sa kanila? Magtapat ka na. Patapos yung bayaw ko na naman po yung bayaw ko na kung ayaw mo magtapat. Ito na naman yung bayan dahil wala na yung dyan mo. Naramdaman ko na, naririnig ko, inaang na yung bayaw ko eh. Sinusuntok. Patapos na naman po ako, yung inawakan ko yung ganito ko po, nilagay sa tubig para magtapat lang. Ikaw. Inawakan yung, katapos yung inawakan yung ulo ko, tinanggal na naman sa tubig. Katapos ko akong tinadyakan, sabi ko po sa kanila, nilalagnat po ako. Sandali, di kumuha ng sako na malaki sako. Diyan po, basta upo ka dyan sa sako. Umupo ako sa sako. Akala ko naman yung pag-upo ko sa sako, hindi ako, ginitin din po ako. Katapos ganyan kataas yung, mataas yung, ng mangga. Ginawa po, ganito siguro kataba yung pinampalod dito sa akin. Dumugo rin po ito. Ito rin. Di sabi ko po sa kanila, huwag nyo na akong pahirapan, patayin nyo na ako. Kasi masakit na yung ginagawa niyo sa akin, sabi sa akin. Patayin nyo ako, pero ang bilin sila pong, hindi, basta aabot din tayo dyan. Basta huwag ka mag-alala, aabot tayo dyan. Kaya lang sa, tapos pinapalo-palo nila ng, nakalagay ako sa sako eh. Hindi sabi, nilalagnat na po ako, sabi sandali. Hindi kumuha din ng ganyang kalaki na galing na akala ko po tubig. May sili na tubig na nilagay po sa sako. Tapos nung nilagay nila po ako sa sako, nilagyan ng sili para mapatapat lang ako. Tapos nung nakaganon na po ako sa ilalim ng sako, nakaganon po ako dahil nakaturing din yung mata ko. Naramdaman ko yung pawis na po ako. Ginawa ko, umihi na lang po ako. Sabi ko po, patayin nyo na po ako. Naiirapan na ako. Ibaba ninyo, ibaba. Yung pagbaba po, hindi rin ako inawakan ng gano'n. Pagbaba. Pagkatapos, natapos na naman, nagtatawa na nila po, dalhin doon sa baba. Hindi talaga umamin ito, dalhin natin sa baba. Pagkatapos na naman, binit na naman po ako nakaganon yung paa. Katapos yung kaldera nila nung ganyang kalaki na pinagulutuan nila po. Yung ulo ko po, nakalagay doon sa kaldera, saka ninalagyan nilang baga. Katapos po ito, pinapalo-palo nila po ito ko. Nakataas po yung ito po, pinapalo-palo nilang nakataas po yung paa ko doon sa katapos tinatawan nila ako, sabi ko sa kanila, patayin mo na lang ako, naiirapan na ako. Sabi nila sa akin, habang patayin ka namin dahil walang tutulong sa'yo. Sabi ko, kahit patayin mo na ako eh, naiirapan na ako talaga, hindi ko na kaya. Matapos na, ginaba na naman ako. Tapos, nakaiga na naman. Gumawa na naman ganito palaki na kaoy. Ginawa ko, tinursili yung anong puwit ko. Gusto kasi nasasaktan na ako. Tapos 4 na beses siguro ginaganon yung puwit ko. Katapos na po yung pinaupo na naman ako. Upo ka, sabi sa akin. Gusto mong kumain. Upo. Katapos, kumuha ng ganyang karami na suka. Yan mo yung bunganga mo. Akala ko naman, ano yung, nilagay ko yung ganyang karami na suka, saka ganyan siguro na asin, saka isang sili. Parang isang sili na, ano ko na po. Katapos,
For our first speaker, she is a rural poor community organizer in Central Luzon and the coordinator of UMAHON Central Luzon. She advocates for peasant, fisher folks, and indigenous peoples' rights by spearheading various campaigns, such as the Save Taliptip campaign in Bulacan, and thus research and organizing work among landless peasants and displaced IPs in Pampanga and Zambales. She also works as a researcher in the Center of Environment Studies Central Luzon, an NGO leading in environmental campaigns and studies. May we call on Gia Clemente.
Hello, good afternoon po. Magandang hapon. So I am Gia of UMAHON Gitnang Luzon. I work as a full-time community organizer in the areas of indigenous people, particularly to the Aita communities in Bataan, Zambales, and Pampanga. And of course, I also work as a organizer in the peasant and fisher folk sector of Bataan and Bulacan. Uh, so basically, Umahon is a people's network between the rural poor sector and church people, and also other environmental advocates. So Umahon is a people's network that believes for the rights of our of our rural poor. So today, together with in IPRI and Umahon Gitnang Luzon, we have decided to launch a webinar to discuss the current state of Aita communities, particularly in Zambales, who are experiencing the threats of mining and militarization, and of course, to expound the case of the first publicly known case of Anti-Terror Act, no, the Lumibaw 4. So, okay. So, okay. Where's my presentation? Do you have my presentation, Mr. Prince? Hello?
Hello, yeah, we will be flashing the presentation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start. So, first, in order for us uh, to know the situation, the ITA situation in Zambales, we have uh, first to have a brief background. What our ITA's situation in the Philippines. So first, okay, the first slide. Okay. So our ITAs of Central Luzon are among the first inhabitants of the Philippines in the pre-colonial times, no? So they live a simple life, no? They are hunter and gatherers, no? So in Central Luzon alone, we have almost 200,000 of ITAs reside in the region. So specifically in Bataan, Pampanga, Tarlac, and Zambales, no, where most of them are found. So in San Marcelino, in the town of San Marcelino, Zambales, there are, if I'm not mistaken, 1,700 plus of ITAs living in the rural villages of Buhawen, uh, San Marcelino, Zambales. Next slide. No, no. Pataas pa po. Second slide lang po. Yeah, okay. So, for our ITAs, no, land is their life. No, they practice collective farming, no, to enrich their crops. And for them, no, indigenous lands became the habitat and source of our ITAs as their source of livelihoods. These were developed and passed down from generation to generation, recognized as ancestral domains, or in Filipino, the lupaing ninuno, no? Before a system of governance was established across the country, these lands were considered their territories. But despite the rich natural resources in their ancestral domain, our Aitas, our fellow Aitas, along with all other indigenous groups, remain in the poorest sector of our society. They are also victims not only of calamities, but also of social inequality and injustice. Next slide. Okay. So in our indigenous, the Aita people depend their lives on the land and nature. So the Aita in Central Luzon usually do the planting. No, they're also farmers actually. They do the hunting, gathering. Sometimes they also do some type of small scale mining, and of course they utilize different operation, or they utilize the resources of their ancestral domain as the common source of their livelihood. And because of that, next slide, like the rest of our indigenous groups in the country, our Aita, as what I have said a while ago, no, they belong to the poorest sector of our society. No, their ancestral lands are being exploited through government concessions for corporations under mining, logging, sometimes ecotourism projects, no, and some commercial agriculture, and those owned by big landlords. So, uh, what are the issues and concerns of our ITAS? No, so for almost a decade of uh, of uh, uh, of Umahon, no, for almost a decade of immersion and integration and organizing the ITA communities, we have uh, we have concluded that uh, there are a lot of issues and concerns of our ITA. So basically, we believe that their number one issue is their right to their ancestral domain, to their lupaing ninuno. So one of the issues that they are currently facing is the land grabbing. So, no, the natural resources in indigenous lands are running out due to the continuous exploitation of big foreign corporations and domestic landlords. Their lands, no, are being the areas of sites of excessive logging, mining, and also converted into huge ranches, plantation of export crops, ecotourism parks, and etc. So aside from that, because what I have said a while ago, a lot of our Aitas are also farmers. So they also face a type of backward and low production. And of course, the deprivation of basic social services and other oppressive laws. So what are these? No, so let's dissect one these issues and concerns of our ITAS. So next slide. Okay, number one is the issue of massive land grabbing or the exploitation of their ancestral domain. So, as you can see, uh, the glaring example of ancestral land exploitation are commercial projects like the leisure parks and so-called Green City in Clark, Pampanga. So, uh, in this issue, I think uh, thousands of Aita families, no, were displaced because of the Clark Green City. Also, huge capitalists came in a guise of ecotourism projects under the Florida Blanca Aitac ancestral domain, or the FAAD, in the Pampanga Zambales boundary. And at present, in the area of Nabuklod, Mawakat, these are the Aita villages in Pampanga. They are being flattened to build highways leading to San Marcelino. We believe that the construction of this road is being done in connection with the resumption of mining exploration of Dizon copper silver mines in Buhawen village. So moreover, next slide, the mining issue are also a great problem of our fellow ITAs. To recall, no, an example of the detrimental effects of mining in the Aita communities is the Benguet Mining Corporation. So, if you can remember, these are owned by the Dizon family and supported by foreign partners. No, it started its operations in Bohawen in late 1960s. So, uh, because of their almost 3 decades of operation, they have extracted 110 billion tons of gold, copper, and other mineral materials, precious metals rather, during the 1980s. And because of this, a huge portion of the Zambales mountain range was damaged, including its river system and the farmlands of our Aitas. So, next slide. So as you can see, uh, these are the photos taken by the DNR. No, these are the evidence of almost 1,000 hectares of water that were poisoned because of the waste from the mining flowed to the lake. And the nearby communities such as Bohawen, Aglao, and Pili uh, were greatly affected by this mining operation. Okay, stop. So because of the uh, great because of the detrimental environmental effect of the mining, no, a lot of Aita communities has been uh, defending their rights. Their call is to not to mine exploration again of decent mine, because there is another threat to the ancestral lands of our Aitas in Barangay Buhawen, San Marcelino, with the impending operation of decent mines of their another mining exploration in the community. So a lot of Aitas were being harassed, were being surveillance, because the elders, the council of elders, no, they from the very start of the FPIC assembly, the free, prior and informed consent that were being given to the companies who are trying to uh, uh, establish a project in the ancestral domain of our Aitas. Our Aita leaders, no, they they have established their stand against the project because of what happened on the Benguet Mining Corporation. No? For them, they no longer need they they want to defend their ancestral domain. So before the operation, the military operation of the on August 21, the main issue of San Marcelino Zambales is the impending mining exploration of Dizon mines. So aside from the issue, next slide, next slide po. Hello? Next slide pa. Okay, yeah. So aside from the issue of massive land grabbing and other other kind of projects, no, in the ancestral domain of our Aitas, because a lot of our Aitas are also farmers. The agricultural produce of our Aitas who are already poor are being subject to backward and low production. So what are these? What's the meaning of this? No, uh, okay. Uh, because of the agricultural produce of our ITAS, they are being sold at lower prices. No, so that's the main that's the another issues uh, faced by our farmers. No, the low production of our agriculture. So the ITAS, this includes their agricultural products, no, such as the banana heart, other fruits and vegetables. Meanwhile, they are being offered with highly priced consumer products, which they usually purchase under loan. So the backward and low production is like if they fail to settle their debts, they will have to surrender a piece of their land that will serve as a payment. So the meager profit they take only comes through their funds as they still have to pay their dues to the sacadoras. So the sacadoras is like middleman, no? Uh, every time the Aitas, our fellow Aitas is trying to sell their products, there is this sakadora who are the one who's buying the products of our Aitas in a cheap price. So as what I have said a while ago, the meager profits only pass through the hands of our indigenous people because they still have to pay their loan products from the so-called sacadoras. So that's the issue of our ITAs in terms of their livelihood, the backward and low production. Next one is next slide. Okay, the next one is the deprivation of the basic social services. No, moreover, because as what I have input a while ago, our ITAs are also considered as the poorest of the poor. So they are at least prioritized citizen of the local government, and a little to no basic services such as education, health, calamity aid are provided. Because of this, they are easily manipulated by the corrupt officials, getting them to agree on bogus projects, programs that are, supposedly done for them. So, in far-flung areas, uh, our ITAs live in a difficult life. So the mode of production is really backward, and public services or no public service rather reaches them, especially aid in their production. So even in basic services such as education and health do not reach them. So this is very tangible during the times of pandemic. No, they are the uh, very least they are not being prioritized by our local government. So another issue of our ITAS is the prolonged state repression and violence. Next slide. As you can see, our ITAs are also usual victims of human rights violations done by our military. So militarization in indigenous communities is an added burden for them. So what are the tangible example of this? Next slide. So as you can, I don't know if you are familiar with the issue of the bombings and the military operation held by the 48th Infantry Battalion and the 7th Infantry Division of the AFP on August 21, 2020. No, bombing operations by these state forces uh, shook the ITAS of Barangay Buhawen in San Marcelino, Zambales. So, what happened? What happened in the community? So on August 21, bombs were dropped in the Aita community of Buhawen village in San Marcelino as part of the military operation of the 48th IB and the 7th Infantry Division of the Philippine Army, which led to an armed encounter with the rebel group called New People's Army. Because of this, around I think 659 individuals and almost 200 families in Sitio Lumibao were forced to evacuate, and there are also reported legitimate instances of bombings, illegal arrests, torture, and the famous forced feeding of feces to one of the indigenous family by the military. So this is Jepoy Gorong. The family is now currently detained, no, and is facing trump-up charges after being accused of being NPA members. Four of them are slapped with charges under Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, illegal possession of explosives, and etc. So aside from the data that we have obtained, the community uh, is currently facing militarization by the 48th IB and the 7th IB. Military operations are still being conducted in their areas through socio-civic programs, but basically, the ITA leaders believe that these are just uh, uh, what do you call this, a passage, no, which are essentially state surveillance activities and psychological war against our ITA community that defending their ancestral domain. So, and also the Aita community fear an impending eviction from the ancestral domain to give way for the foreign mining firm and other business to operate. Particularly, that is the mining exploration of Dizon Copper Silver Mines Corporation. Okay. So, next slide. Okay, next slide po. So, one of the account of the family that were detained by the military, that Tatay Manuel, no, if I can recall, the family of Tatay Manuel Ramos, Japer Garung, and Junior Ramos, no, they have experienced a lot of uh, not just physical harassment but also verbal. They were tortured by the military, and there are also reports of theft of their livelihood. So, uh, hello, hello. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Nawawala po yung signal ko. Wait lang po ah. So, uh, okay, let's continue. So, what I have said a while ago, no? So, those are the examples of the military of the prolonged state operation, state surveillance, state violence rather, or repression being done against our indigenous people. So it's not just in the sector, it's not just in the ITA sector of Central Luzon. This kind of state repression is systematic, and it's been happening all over the Philippines, no? But uh, aside from this state repression, the violence against our indigenous people communities, there are also oppressive laws that I think we believe in Omahon should be addressed, because this kind of these laws, no, are being used against to our Aita communities. So what are those, no? So number one is the Mining Act of 1995. Because of this act, no, it is being used by big corporation to justify the what you call this, the pandarambong, no, the pandarambong of their ancestral domain, or the plunder rather, no. As you can see, one of the loophole of Mining Act of 1995 is in the section 18. It indicates that all mineral wealth from public and private lands, along with lumber or forest, can be open for mining operations. So that is the problem of this act, because uh, uh, our government uh, justify the ground uh, to all public land, including the ancestral domain or the lupain ninuno of our Aitas. So because of this act, there are also systematic attacks on the communities because of the done by the different mining companies. Next slide. So another law that were being used against our indigenous people is the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act of 1995. uh, this act should this is supposedly a law intended to protect the indigenous people rights, uh, but the irony of this is that it erases the concept of communal use of the ancestral lands of indigenous people. They allow the privatization and trade of ancestral lands, no. The agency that being mandated to protect and advance the basic rights of our national minorities is the one that created under the IPRA as a super body that manages and represents the indigenous people, no. They serve as a brokers of ancestral lands through approving projects within the ancestral domain. So moreover, next slide. So the next law is the anti-terror laws, no? So we all know the loopholes of anti-terror law 2020, and I have stated that the first publicly known victim of Anti-Terror Act 2020 are national minorities, are indigenous people, our fellow ITAs, no? They are not actually they're just they're just victim uh, they're just a victim of the military operations done by the 48 IB and the 7 IB, no. uh, so these are the laws that we believe in Omahon are being used against our Aita sector. So indeed, next slide. So if there's a problem, we believe in Umahon, we have to come up with a solution. So we believe that the aspiration of our ITAs is number one, the recognition of their ancestral land rights, and of course, the their livelihood to their to traditional and adaptation. So what's the meaning of this? Number one, the aspiration of our ITAS is first the recognition of ancestral domain. We believe that it is very important to continuously study as to understand the plight and the cause behind this issue. So we believe that the strong unity why the ITAS should come together is to unite with other sector, because the issue of their ancestral lands, no, the issue of the land rights is also issue of the biggest sector in our country, which is the peasant sector. So we believe that by pursuing the the rights of our indigenous people to defend their ancestral land rights, no, we can obtain and jointly advance the 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 rights and talents of our fellow ITAs. So what our indeed, next slide, Umahon demands and calls for the immediate release, next slide, immediate release of the Lumibo 4. So we believe that we have to unite with the indigenous people in attaining the peace and justice. No, we have to join the fight of our ITAs, because they they because aside from the fact that they remain the poorest of the poor, no, they are being subjected to different types of human rights violations, and we have to join their fight, because these are all these are all being done because of the issue of their ancestral lands. Next slide. So in order for us to unite, no, we believe that we have to draw different individual groups, organization to support and unite the fight of the indigenous people. So next slide. So Umahon urgently calls to stop the militarization uh, of the 703rd Brigade and the 7th Infantry Division in the ancestral domain of Zambales mountain range. And of course, junk all the trump-up charges against the Lumibo 4 and justice for the Lumibo 4 who experienced torture and different kind of human rights violation being done by uh, the military. And of course, a swift investigation into the bombing and military operations in ancestral domain and affected communities of our Aitas in Zambales. And uh, to urgently call also is to fight the exploitation of the natural not just exploitation but the plunder of the natural resources, no, and the mining, stop the impending mining exploration of decent copper, silver mines and corporation. And indeed, we believe that we have to join the fight of our indigenous people, of our fellow Aitas, in defending their right to ancestral land. No, so with that, uh, I think I am finished to discuss the short situationer of Aita situation in Zambales. So to end my discussion, uh, we in UMAHON is calling to all different sector individuals to let us live in solidarity with the indigenous people in building our common future for a just and peaceful society by joining our Aitas in their struggle for the right to land and life. So that's all, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gia, for that informative report on the situation of the ITAS in San Marcelino, Zambales. I believe we will continue with our second speaker to provide more details on what Ms. Gia discussed earlier as the Lumibaw 4. Our next speaker is a human rights lawyer and a member of the National Union of the People's Lawyers Central Luzon chapter. At present, he is the lead counsel of Lumibaw 4 Aita case in Olongapo City and other political prisoners in Central Luzon. May we call on Attorney Bonifacio F. Cruz Jr.
Hello, good afternoon.
Afternoon, sir.
Yes, good afternoon. So, I'm here to discuss regarding the status of the case of the Lumibaw 4. So, the antecedent facts, the 9 ATAs were arrested on August 21, 2020, because during that time there was an encounter between the New People's Army and the Philippine Army, the under 703rd Brigade. And with that, these 9 arrested ITAs, members of them were tortured as shown in the video, as narrated by the victim himself. And the 9 arrested ITAs includes a 3-year-old child being held during that time on August 21. They were held 6 days from the time of their arrest on August 21 up to August 26 before they were brought for uh, uh, a particular charge against them. Now, the status of the case is that the 9 ITAs arrested, only 4 were charged for the crime of violation of Republic Act 11479, otherwise known as the Anti-Terrorism Act or the Anti-Terrorism Law, which this law is being questioned before the Supreme Court for its constitutionality and also for being a repressive law against the people. The among the 9 ATAs, only 4 were charged. The 2 minors were the 2 minors accused, Rosaline, the name, Ray Serrano and Rosalyn Urbano. Those were the two minors arrested and now under the custody of the DSWD. And they are charged for violation of illegal possession of firearms and explosives. That's why the offense considered non-bailable. And the two other accused, Japer Gurong and Junior Ramos, are charged for illegal possession of ammunition and explosives, the same with the two minors, and the violation of anti-terrorism law. So far, the proceeding of the case is the presentation of evidence for the prosecution. The prosecution for the case of the two accused charged for violation of anti-terrorism law. And the incorporated therein is the violation of illegal possession of explosives and ammunition. The other two accused were already arraigned and pre-trial has been conducted, and the next hearing for the presentation of prosecution's evidence will be held in January. Same with the setting of the two accused for violation of anti-terrorism law. The direct injury for the anti-terrorism law is now manifesting and no longer an imagination, as said by those who are pushing for the law to implement. Because during the time there was no injury yet, but now for this particular situation, we can now claim that there is a direct injury inflicted to the people, especially to those who are in the IPs or to our Aetas in San Marcelino. The said repressive law now showed it that this particular law is designed to repress and also to restrict people from showing support for any other endeavor to change this repressive state. This particular incident in San Marcelino also manifests that it is one of the state fascism happening not only in Zambales but all over the country. The said anti-terror law is now being implemented. Even during that time, there was no implementing rules and regulation enacted by the government. And by this particular situation, it is very dangerous now to say that this anti-terror law is really dangerous to exist for repressing those people who are there to suggest changes or some sort of activism to change the repressive state of our society, particularly this regime under Duterte administration. The National Union of the NUPL, the National Union of People's Lawyers, are handling the case of this Lumibaw 4 in Olongapo City, RTC Olongapo City, to show that we are adhering that for those who have less in life, we must give them more in law. And the National Union of People's Lawyer is condemning this said anti-terror law, and we are calling for the uh, declaration of the same as unconstitutional, together with other repressive law enacted by this state. And we are very determined to fight for the rights of those four Lumibaos arrested in San Marcelino, and we are looking forward for their early release and dismissal of their case, because there is no evidence that they are really uh, connected or should be charged for that particular provision of law of this anti-terror law, wherein they were charged for Section 4, because the said law was used in consideration that during the encounter there was a member of the Philippine Army who died in the said incident, and that law qualified, instead of filing a murder as a punish under the revised penal code, then this law of Republic Act 11749 will be used as the charge, which is more dangerous to protect the interests and rights of the suspect. Remember, the family of the Lumibaos were the arrested accused were held 6 days, more than the hours that they said for the crime of or a crime defined under the revised penal code should be not more than the hours as provided therein. In fact, under the terrorism law, a suspect can be held in custody of the law enforcer up to 24 days. And it happens to the four Lumibaos, and it can happen to anybody.
Okay. Thank you very much, Attorney Cruz, for that very informative discussion on the case of the Lumibaw 4, which I believe a lot of our audience are really looking forward to knowing about, since this is the first publicly charged case of the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. So, part of our objective in IPRI in conducting this webinar is to be able to make the case of the Indigenous Aetas in San Marcelino, as well as the trumped up charges of the Lumibaw 4 known. So the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 is one of the most controversial law passed in the country, resulting to different sectors to forge unities and call for the junking of the terror law. So to expound further, may I call on our third and last speaker. She works with the Legal Rights and Natural Resources Center Friends of the Earth Philippines, a policy, legal, and advocacy institution that works for the recognition and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples and communities to land and other natural resources. One of the persons who filed for the petition against the anti-terrorism law on behalf of the indigenous peoples and Moro peoples. May we call on Attorney Mai M. Takeban.
Magandang hapon. Good afternoon to everyone. Prince, let me just share
Okay.
screen if I may. I'm just going to share screen, huh?
Okay.
Is that fine? Hold on. I want to make it bigger. I'll do my best to speak as fast as I can, but please indulge me if ever I go over time. So I wanted to expound more, like you said, no, about the anti-terrorism law, but contextualizing it in the shall we say, the national security framework of the country, no? Sige. I won't share muna my camera, so I'm sure that I don't get cut off with my connection, if that's all right. So the Duterte administration crafted the national security policy. This was for 2017-2022. And as you can see on your screen, previous administrations already had their national security policy. For this administration, I will quote, no, it has a very lofty vision, a Filipino nation that has an empowered people with dedicated and professional leaders living in freedom, dignity, and prosperity. No, it's intended to be providing guidance. But a part of its mandate is to quell all existing secessionist and ideological rebellions and address the root causes to secure the lives of Filipino citizens. So that's what this framework is, in gist, is all about. Let me move the slides. Okay, but very quickly, let's talk about how do we define human security. No, the concept has since evolved. No, from a very traditional military state-centric kind of defining security, it has since broadened to include what are the many things that go into securing individuals or securing citizens. This would be economic, food security, the health, the environment, the personal, the community, and policy security. No? The end goal of which is freedom from fear. Now, when we say freedom from fear, it means freedom from violence or anything that encompasses security in the physical sense. No, when we say freedom from want, it covers the many social and economic problems, which include, poverty, economic inequality, discrimination, so on and so forth. So, from this definition of the UNDP, we can see that the many things that go into the discourse or the idea of security is more than just security forces, more than just the military, no? If we are to really address security problems. So very quickly, the national security framework is often translated into legislation, no? Because this is supposed to be the social contract, the contracts by which we enter into uh, what they become the Duralex Sedlex, the law of the land. And I got this caption from the news, and this does not talk about the anti-terrorism law. This actually is still about the Human Security Act of 2007. And even with the Human Security Act of 2007, many people were already finding it very problematic. No, in fact, the International Commission of Jurists were already asking the Congress of the Philippines to reconsider. No, some of the aspects of the law then were, the unfettered surveillance power, the arbitrary deprivation, the right to what do you call curtailing of the right to liberty, and all these many risks. No, the possible breaches in right to privacy, information, etc., freedom of expression and opinion that was already couched in the Human Security Act of 2007. And then, of course, very lately, of recently, we have its new reincarnation, no? Which is the anti-terror law, which was passed by our Congress right in the middle of a pandemic. So this is one of a photograph in one of the rallies. And for almost the same reasons as the Human Security Act of 2007, many people already, how do you call this, called attention, no, to the possible enmities, to the possible risks that this law could bring about. And these are some of the captions, the news captions that you will find, no, the possibility of usurping court powers against freedom of speech, some incidents already of human rights abuses. And of course, the Lumibao 4 is a very concrete example of that. No? But this human security framework also gets translated into many things. No? And way back in 2002, for example, the government, this was Arroyo's time, I believe, came up with Oplan Bantaylaya. Later on, it would have its version 2. No, a total of 305 people were actually killed. Most of them were alleged leftists and associated with the communist groups. To the point that we had a special rapporteur, Philip Alston, no, saying that one of the basis of the killings of many of these people were really their alleged affiliation with organizations. No? Gloria at that time, former President Arroyo, was met with a lot of pressure, and so they came up with a Melo Commission. Even the Melo Commission said that again, it was all allegations of being members, no, of organizations, and they were considered as enemies of the state. No? Here we have another news clip that pretty much illustrates what is going on the ground. No, the so-called Luma death squads. This would be in Mindanao. Another case of that would be the Oplan Bayanihan. This would be the time of Aquino, no, who himself had said that being a victim of extrajudicial killing would not want to have extrajudicial killing in his administration. But that notwithstanding, a total of 102 IPs, Indigenous peoples, were killed during his regime, no? Including one, Dionel Campos, a community leader of the IP group. The Business and Human Rights identifies some of the facts that may have led into his killing. No, this was because he was asserting his rights, his community's rights against Felix mining. In 2017, Duterte came up with his own version of Oplan. This would be the Oplan Kapayapaan. No, Duterte terminated Oplan Bayanihan because initially in the early part of his regime, he wanted to get into peace talks with the so-called insurgent groups, but later on came up with his own Oplan Kapayapaan. And the optics by which the government has now tried to, how do we say, change the packaging of this is to switch it to a civilian-led tactic to address insurgency. And so now we have the LCAC, no, trying to get a lot, trying to involve a lot of the executive departments in its execution, no, and the execution of some of the programs that they have. To support that, no, in 2018, President Duterte came up with Executive 70, which is institutionalizing the whole of nations approach. And precisely this is now the task force to end all local communist armed conflict. But this is also now directly involving your DSWD, etc., etc. And some of this narratives we can find in the government website of the PIA, no? How they're supposed to be using it to revitalize certain efforts for development, revitalize efforts to address the root causes of the insurgency, etc., and claiming victory. So optics is also very important. Here we can say now that it's also a lot of, what do you call this, the way the government as represented by your president regards lumads and regards people who dissent or groups of people who contradict him or his what he perceives as his own government policy. No, Duterte says communist rebels are terrorists because he simply declares them so. No, and the caretaking by which he wants to look at Lumad communities or indigenous peoples communities is to keep them away from MPAs. It's still a very securitizing way of looking at development and looking at peace. But these things are not new. No, the anti-terror law is certainly not new. The Human Security Act is not new. In the history of the Philippines, we've had the Anti-Subversion Act of 1957 under Carlos Garcia. This would be later repealed in 1992 by then, if I'm not mistaken, was it Corazon Aquino, no? But before that repeal, in 1957, President Marcos came up with 885 in 1976, no, and later PD 1835 in 1981, no. President Aquino would repeal both, but the aim of these two PDs really was to intended to address the Hukbalhap insurgency. Again, anything that diminished the control or the power of the state. These were some of the policies. Um, of course, the issue of security, is cannot be taken separate from the global issues on terrorism. But here we see how even that is already also changing. Brown University came up with a report that the U.S. global war on terror has displaced 59 million people. I'm not that. It's very important to read properly the report because it doesn't say terrorism has displaced 59 million people, but it's the whole effort. It's the whole war plan on terrorism that has actually displaced 59 people. The face and the realities of terrorism is also morphed. No, in the United States, for example, this has become more of a far right terrorism. Intra rather than the usual stereotypical of your Moro insurgent, your Moro separatist, or your Islamic State terrorist. So there are these complexions now on the concept of terrorism that perhaps some of our policies have not yet contended with. Of course, very recently, as Bonifacio had talked about, the recent case with the Lumibao 4. Um, this conversation on security, this conversation on terrorism, especially in relation and its impact on indigenous peoples, is cannot be separate from development aggression. Here you have the Blaan tribe. They suffered the massacre of their leaders. That has not yet seen justice up to now, and at the heart of the discourse, at the heart of the discontent there is really the SMI Tampakan Mining Corporation that wants to mine in their ancestral domain. On the other hand, the Tamasco 8, 8 people were massacred. That was 3 years ago. Recently, we commemorated that, December 3. Up to now, 3 years after the massacre, no justice has been given them. No justice has been vindicated of the families, and the ancestral domains also is at the heart of a contentious development project, a large agro-industrial coffee plantation. So these are inseparable. Very often, when indigenous peoples rise to protest, rise to resist, it's in protection of their ancestral domains. And that directly puts them in, how do you say, in collision course with the government's development plans or the government's concept of development. So here we can see also how the notion of security is being applied in development in a sense that development has been securitized. Here we see a lot of clippings, across time, how many indigenous communities and indigenous persons have been ragtagged, as insurgents, as terrorists, etc., etc. So here you have a co-opting of the notion of human security or of security, but it is to how do I say this? It's to engender insecurity rather than securing communities. It's engendering insecurity in communities. And what you have here now is a government's approach to human security, which frames everything as if everything is in war, war on drugs, war on COVID-19, war on terror, in such a way that by framing this so, the government is able to engender an atmosphere of urgency, if not emergency, that normalizes this kinds of situation, that normalizes this powers of the government. And that's also one of the dangers of having policies that are petrified in law, because then they don't simply become emergency powers in times of emergency. They become your everyday law that then becomes normalized, no? So the foes in this context, no, are those that are defiant, those are disobedient, the dissenter, indigenous communities that rise up against wealthy tycoons whose business interests, no, uh, and their business interests are part and parcel, perhaps, no, necessary for the preservation of the state. So you have here the conflation of the interests of your businesses and that of the maintaining of power of state. So your national security framework, this kind of national security framework, actually sets the stage for furthering the security agenda of the state in a way that it uses obfuscation, that it confuses, no, by defining certain acts as terrorism, no, it defines a state of exemption, no, whereby your constitutionally protected rights, and democratic processes are curtailed through the use of the state's police power, no. The reason behind, because the state needs to protect itself, no. But for indigenous peoples, human security starts with addressing ancestral land and domains rights. Their inherent right to own, manage, and control their lands must be respected. And again, I will belabor the point that very often this is in collision course with the business interest, with the development interest of the state. No, it is very often the policy of the state has been inconsistent with indigenous customs and their traditional understanding of land ownership, no. As explained very earlier, the Aitas look at their land, the management of their land, very different from the Mining Act, very different from other policies of the government, no. So still, what we see here is a continuation of Philippine laws adopting colonial laws. We were never able to divest ourselves of that, regarding land ownership, the assertion of the state as owning public lands, and so on and so forth. No, um, such that here what we see is resistance from indigenous communities have been met with militarization and rights violation, that instead of prioritizing IP rights, they are tagged as rebels or insurgents, or if not, petty criminals. If not criminals, they're charged with murder, etc. So the labels terrorist, insurgents, these have all become your catch-all phrase, no, a pretext to attack, to stop Lumads who are or indigenous peoples who are actually defending their rights. No? The consequence of this is that they're pushed to the wall, no, by the same government that is implementing aggressive development projects, no, which are then backed by your security operations, which are done in the guise of human security. No, so what we see here is a security framework that misses on the mark. No, misses on the mark on what it means to address the root causes of maldevelopment, the root causes of conflicts. No, but in many ways, no, because hope springs eternal, we see a lot of people still coming together and calling our attention to this movements by the government. No? Uh, one of one of the one of the things that we can see, you have 37 petitions filed against this current law, and this current petition is filed by a broad array of groups of people, from young people to bloggers, no, and of course our own petitioners, indigenous peoples. And if I may point out, a lot of them are women leaders that are asserting, calling attention to the risks of this law. There are no longer risks, by the way, because now with the Lumibao 4, it's actually been actualized. The danger has been actualized. I go back to how we define right to self-determination under the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, no? And let me read that. The state recognizes the inherent right of indigenous communities and IPs to self-governance and self-determination and respect the integrity of their values, practices, and institutions. Consequently, the state shall guarantee the right of ICCs and IPs to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And very obviously, with the Lumibao 4 and with other IP communities, this is not what we are seeing. And this is the kind of right that stands to be further diminished as we proceed, as the government proceeds in following with this kind of human security framework. So I will end there. Thank you very much for your time and your patience and listening.
Wow. Thank you, Attorney Takeban, for that. Um, for thoroughly contextualizing the security laws and the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 by looking into the orientation of the Philippine government and its policies, and really showing such trends manifest and go in the global scale, and how such security laws affect the indigenous peoples, or to even forward development aggression projects and businesses, which is the agenda of our country right now. And such laws also diminish or destroys the concept of recognizing and respecting the inherent rights of the indigenous peoples to their ancestral lands and their right to self-determination. Okay, so that ends the presentation of our speakers. So feel free to use the chat box feature to introduce yourself and your organization so that we could welcome you once again. You may also use the question and answer feature if you have inquiries, which will be answered or responded by our speakers after the presentation. IPRI will also send the link of calls in the chat box, which we will be using at the closing session for our symbolic action. Kindly download the calls and post them on social media at the end of the session. You may also use the hashtags hashtag FreeLumibo4, hashtag Defend the ITAS, and hashtag Junk Terror Law when you post or tweet on different social media sites. Before we open the floor for inquiries, we invited staunch climate justice activists, environmentalists, a church leader, a global coordinator for IP rights, and the youngest female legislator of the country to express their sentiments on the case of the ITAS in San Marcelino and the Lumibao 4. For our first reactor, he is a full-time environment activist based in the Philippines. He is the current educational coordinator of the Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, and is also the national spokesperson of Saribuhay, a youth environment organization. May I call on John Bonifacio?
Hello? Okay, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so thank you very much to the speakers for presenting very thoroughly the situation of our ITAS in Zambales, as well as, again, contextualizing it in the framework of the anti-terrorism law in particular. So I guess I'd just like to highlight the mining situation here in the Philippines and how it has really impacted our indigenous peoples. Because the experience of the ITAS in Central Luzon and is not unique in the way that a lot of indigenous peoples across the Philippines are experiencing very similar problems as a result of large-scale mining operations here in the Philippines. For example, what the Lumad are experiencing in Mindanao also have a lot to do with mining, and those mining operations and the subsequent militarization of their areas has also led to forced evacuations, the closure of schools, of community schools in the area, which really infringes upon the rights of our indigenous peoples. In a study that was conducted by Saribuhay recently, released recently, an assessment of the environmental defender situation of here in the Philippines under President Duterte, we've actually seen that roughly a third of of all of the documented extrajudicial killings of our land and environment defenders are actually related to mining, and around 20% or a fifth of these, at least a fifth of these, are indigenous people. So really, our indigenous peoples are at the front line of defending our environment and, of course, their ancestral lands, their right to life from these over extractive industries like mining and logging and what have you. So it's really important that we recognize that this problem is not just um, unique, or not just something that's what do you call that, an exception, but more of the rule really here in the Philippines. And it's important to unite and clamor for justice for everybody, all of the people, all of the indigenous peoples who have been affected by these very problematic practices of mining companies as well as the state.
Thank you very much, Sir John Bonifacio. Now, may we call on our second reactor? She is a climate justice activist based in Metro Manila, Philippines. She is the convener and international spokesperson of the Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, an alliance of individuals and youth formations that advocates for the immediate, youth-led, and collective global climate action, climate justice, defense of environmental defenders, and system change. May I call on Mitzi Joel Tan.
Hi everyone, so I'm Mitzi Janelle Tan. I am the convener of Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, and one of the reasons why I actually became a climate activist, why I'm now a full-time climate activist, is because I was able to integrate and talk to one of our indigenous leaders here in the Philippines. And he was telling us about how they were being displaced, killed, harassed, and militarized, basically what our wonderful speakers showed us today. And then he so casually shrugged and chuckled and laughed and said, "That's why we have no choice but to fight back." And then he went on talking about different things. And really, it was the simplicity of how he said it, how he wasn't even trying to convince us that we should become activists, that really got to me. That's when I realized that I had this privilege to choose to become an activist, and that he was right. We don't have a choice. We have to join the people's struggle. We have to join the fight of our indigenous peoples to protect our planet, our environment, our homes. And this is something that's happening across the world. It's not just happening in the Philippines. It's always our indigenous peoples that are at the front line of environmental defense against mining corporations, coal-fired power plants, dirty energies, and all these multinational companies that are plundering our lands and causing the climate crisis, which is who is being most affected by those. It's still also the indigenous peoples, our small farmers, our small fisher folks, the urban poor, the marginalized sectors of society. So really, if we look at it, it's all interconnected. They are the ones who are plundering our lands. They are the ones who are displacing our communities. They are also the ones causing all these extreme weather events, which if you guys are from the Philippines, you know very well. Just a few weeks ago, we experienced two massive typhoons, and this isn't normal anymore. This is something that's being caused by the imperialist system that is encouraging overproduction and greed and over extraction. And what we really need to do now is to unite with our indigenous peoples to expose what's happening and unite the indigenous peoples across the world and join their fight and really amplify their voices in this call for system change.
Thank you very much, Mitzi, for that take on, for that comprehensive take on the system of plunder that happens not only in the Philippines but also the world, and how it affects our minority groups. For our next reactor, may I call on? He is an elder of the United Methodist Church and a member of the Bulacan, Philippines Annual Conference. He is a former chairperson of BULPAC, Board of Church and Society, and currently serves as chaplain of Harris Memorial College. May I call on Rev. Estelito M. Binuya.
Good afternoon. Let me share with you my personal statement as a church leader. The matter our government treats people who are seeking peace and justice for their own and their community is unquestionably bothering. Instead of being coddled by the government, they become the victims of a discriminatory and unjust law. It's not permissible for the church people because we believe that the authority and power given to us by the Lord is to lift and strengthen people in their affliction, like what our Lord Jesus did here on earth. He fed the hungry, healed the sick, gave an inspiration by his teaching, by teaching the parables, freedom for those in prison, and delivered compassion and rendered ministry to the poor and the oppressed. Even in the Old Testament, through the prophet Micah, the Lord showed us and required us to act justly and love mercy. That is where the church stands in its ministry and service. If there are untoward situations in the community, if there are injustices and oppression, churches and religious people have to take their stance for the poor and the oppressed and the victims of an unjust deed. Those are the ministry exemplified by Jesus, and the same voices exclaimed of the prophets in the Bible. And since our national minority is now experiencing this kind of repression, it is a call for us church people to exercise our prophetic spirit, to denounce this kind of treatment. Let us voice out the wickedness of the authority. Let us denounce this kind of evilness in our society. Let us hinder every developmental project and scheme that may destroy our natural world and the ancestral land. Katulad ng nangyari nung nakaraang Typhoon Ulysses na dumagsa ang putik sa mula sa kabundukan patungo sa kapatagan dahil sa pagbibigay ng permiso ng pamahalaan sa mga dambuhalang kumpanya na agawin at sirain ang ating kalikasan kasama ng mga ninunong lupain. Ito ang mga bagay na dapat ay mariing tinututulan at hinahadlangan ng ating mga mamamayan kasama ang sektor ng mga taong simbahan. As church people, let us affirm that all persons are equally valuable in the sight of God. The people of God work together for a society where its person's value is recognized, maintained, and strengthened. Kaya't ipagtanggol natin ang basic rights ng lahat ng tao, anuman ang kanyang uri o pinagmulan. Let us deplore acts of violence against groups or persons based on their economic condition, ethnicity, or even gender identity and religious affiliation. Ipanawagan natin na respetuhin ng lahat ang Universal Declaration of Human Rights upang ang mundo natin at ang lipunan natin ay magkaroon ng isang maayos, mapayapa at ganap na pamumuhay. Ito lamang. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sir Rev Estelito Binuya. Actually, we also would like to recognize the efforts of the church to stand with the people, stand with the poor, stand with the indigenous peoples, the farmers, for the longest time, while in most cases, those that are mandated to serve the people or the government have neglected or have been the source of our oppression. For our next reactor, she is a Filipino activist and politician representing the youth under Kabataan Party List in the House of Representatives. She is known as the youngest female legislator of the Congress, the principal author of the Comprehensive Free Public Higher Education Bill in 2017, which benefits an estimate of 2 million college students annually. She is the only Filipino to receive the One Young World Politician of the Year 2020, which recognizes the most impactful politicians that use their positions to create change for young people in the communities and countries. May we call on Ms. Honorable Sarah Jane Elago.
Hi, thank you, Prince. Thank you, Indigenous Peoples Rights International, for having this youth representation here as a reactor in this webinar on the persistence of militarization and political persecution against the Indigenous Aetas of Zambales. We in Kabataan strongly condemn the inhumane and degrading treatment and detention of minors Rosalind Urbano, Kiray Serrano, and the rest of Lumibao 4, and the worsening attacks on Indigenous peoples' rights. We must raise our voices to free Lumibao 4. We must raise our voices to call for an end to bombings and militarization that have inflicted further suffering and tragedy among the Indigenous Aetas. We stand in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples in protesting against abuse, exploitation, and plunder. Under this tyrannical regime, killings, harassment, threats, and crackdowns on progressives and dissenters stifle the struggles of the people for their rights and welfare. So now, more than ever, we must remain steadfast and continue adding our voices to our fellow youth, young Aitas, and their communities in the fight for the right to self-determination. We must stand together to demand justice and accountability for all the victims of human rights violations. We must also defend the frontline role of the young people, of the youth, in adding their voices to defend the Aitas and the Indigenous peoples. Youth and students being vocal on drug war killings, attacks on Indigenous peoples, issues of corruption and abuse of power, attacks on press freedom and violations of human rights are now clearly being targeted and singled out through crackdown on their representation, on their right to speak up and speak out on various societal issues and contribute to a nation building. There's also the apparent pervasive practice of red tagging, terror tagging, and vilification against activists, dissenters, and the political opposition that threaten and violates the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to security of the people. And these violations have really made the performance of our noble mandate as a party-list representative to raise the voices or to add our voices to the voices of the marginalized and underrepresented sectors more dangerous. But we must persist and we hold our heads up high as we join together, stand together to raise our voices to junk terror law and defend human rights. Defend the Aitas, free Lumibao 4, stop the attack.
Uh, Thank you very much, Honorable Sara Ilago. Actually, on behalf of the youth and on behalf of the, I believe, rest of the Filipino people, we would like to express our appreciation as well for genuinely representing the youth and minority sectors of society in the Congress. And also, not only that, but also immersing with us, fighting with us, struggling with us, especially amidst the um, horrendous attacks of the state towards activists, towards advocates, and the rest of the law abiding Filipino people and freedom loving Filipinos. So we thank you. Okay. For our final reactor, she is the global coordinator of the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, IPMSDL, a global movement of grassroots-based Indigenous peoples organization and organizations, communities, and advocates. She is also an International Solidarity Officer of Katribu, a national alliance of Indigenous peoples organizations in the Philippines. May I call on Miss Beverly Longid.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Prince, for that introduction, and thank you for IPRI for inviting us to be part of this event. I'd just like to add some of my thoughts not to what the speakers have mentioned. One, as you mentioned, I am from the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation. I am also Indigenous myself, being an Igorot from the Cordilleras belonging to the Bontoc and Kankanaoy peoples. And recently, in the Senate hearing in relation to the Anti-Terror Act in December 1, our organization has been named, has been tagged as as part of the Communist Party of the Philippines under its so-called, well, according to the military the National Propaganda and Cultural Commission. And it is very unfortunate that the person who presented this is the current chairperson of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, the NCIP, which is a mandated agency of the Philippine government to look into the rights and welfare of indigenous peoples, and who also happens to be the executive director of the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict. So now you see, as what the others have mentioned, the collusion between the different government agencies to red tag or to destroy people's movement, especially indigenous peoples. One of the first point, well, indigenous peoples, worldwide are known to be are known for their brave, if not for their fierce, resistance against colonization or defense of their ancestral lands or territories against encroachment. And this defiance continues to present day. As mentioned by Gia and our previous speakers, the indigenous peoples are in the front lines of the struggle to protect or save the environment from plunder, mining and energy, from land conversion schemes like malls, what you call this, real estate, or even big businesses for tourism, and even so-called conservation projects. Well, because unfortunately, probably because the remaining natural resources that we have, not only in the Philippines, but in the entire world, are found in indigenous peoples' territories. And these resources are not only vital for our survival as indigenous peoples, but of course of all people and the planet. And I would agree that land is a central issue. This would be a core issue in relation to the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples. But because in not only in the Philippines, but in other parts of the world, states actually do not recognize the land rights of indigenous peoples. Worse, in many countries, especially here in Asia and Africa, many indigenous peoples are not even recognized as indigenous peoples. They are so afraid to recognize tribes, minorities, ethnic groups as indigenous peoples, because once they do so, the right to self-determination attaches. Therefore, they are obliged to recognize the core issue of right to self-determination, which is ancestral land. Second point, unfortunately, this defense has been largely met by repression against those who are critical of government policies or those who are opposing these destructive projects. And not only by repression, it comes in various forms, but also in the form of militarization. Now, third point, who is responsible? I think this has to be emphasized. These attacks are perpetrated by the state. And often, these are done in collusion with the local elite. And of course, with foreign corporations who will benefit in the plunder or of these resources found in indigenous territories. Now, the attacks comes in various forms. We have already seen the torture, the killing, etc., the trump-up charges, criminalization. But what is increasing now, which is not only in the Philippines, it is yung terrorist tagging and false information in social media, which has intensified during this period of lockdown. So I would agree that terrorist tagging or red tagging would put the security and well-being of indigenous peoples at risk. But I think it also undermines the legitimacy of the struggles of indigenous peoples. Because when you are tagged as a terrorist or you are filed with trump-up charges, criminal charges, it paints the pictures that indigenous peoples are common criminals or ill repute, not capable of leading the struggles of indigenous peoples to defend their territories. And this terrorist tagging actually also worsens yung discrimination against indigenous peoples. So we are not only looked at as dirty or second-class citizens, but we are now looked at as dirty terrorists or second-class citizens made worse by being terrorists. So in other words, because we are called terrorists, our legitimate struggles are put at the back. Now, fourth point, um, in relation to militarization, this is also a common problem, no? Especially in countries that belong to the global south. No? And this comes in the form of not only of bombings, no, of communities, but actual deployment of soldiers in communities, in indigenous peoples' communities. And with militarization comes various types of human rights violations. Such as mentioned already, the arrest and detention. But I would like to put emphasis on the impact of militarization on indigenous women and girls. No? We have documented for the past decade that with militarization, not only comes sexual assault, no, or sexual harassment, but an increasing incidence of weaponizing rape, no, against indigenous peoples. And often, women are also impregnated, indigenous women, and they are abandoned. And we see this in countries like in Bangladesh, mostly in South Asia. Now, probably the last point. In countries now with existing liberation movements like the Philippines, and many are found in Asia, like we have in Burma, we have in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, in India. Once you are tagged as a terrorist and part of an underground armed revolutionary movement, you are looked at by law as a combatant, no, and therefore subject for attack. In the case of the Philippines, and as that we have seen in the case of our brothers and sisters AISTA, there was really no distinction between who is a civilian and who is a combatant. Therefore, everybody who is critical of government is now considered an enemy of the state. Now, going to the Anti-Terror Act, even before the Anti-Terror Act, the indigenous peoples are actually labeled already as terrorists, no? Different form, words, you know, Reds, rebels. Our organizations are considered as fronts or supporters of the New People's Army. And our communities are even labeled as red areas or rebel-infested areas. So therefore, when we look at these attacks against indigenous peoples, repressive measures, and militarization, it is not only an instrument of government, of state, no, to to stop the movement of indigenous peoples against these destructive projects. It now also becomes a weapon for counterinsurgency. And well, I would admit that I think in most cases, really a significant number of the finest sons and daughters of indigenous peoples are part of this revolutionary movement. But the issue is not simply if they are or they are not members of this revolutionary movement, but what drives them to join these movements. No? And I think in this, I mean, we are now in a very challenging times. I mean, amid the pandemic, amid these different disasters that we are facing, and now it is worsened by these state terror attacks against us. I hope, no, that with our continuing efforts to address these issues, like what we are doing now, and greater solidarity, we are not paralyzed by fear, and I would still look forward to the growing solidarity between and among indigenous peoples, the growing solidarity between and among indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples. And of course, since these are common issues that we share with other indigenous peoples in different parts of the world, is to also build up our international solidarity. So again, thank you for inviting us, and we give tribute and honor to our living heroes, indigenous peoples, and our martyrs who have died in the struggle. So again, thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Ms. Beverly, for that powerful take on the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020 and the attacks against the indigenous people, not only in the Philippines but around the world. Now, before we open the floor, just a very short promotion. So we would like to also invite the guests that we have here, our attendees, to our webinar, upcoming webinar on December 9th to commemorate the International Human Rights Day. It's entitled Live Under Threat, Responding to the Collective Impacts of Increasing Violence Against Indigenous Peoples and Criminalization. Again, it's on December 9, 2020. You can check it on our social media pages. So kindly check our Facebook and also our Twitter account. So at IPRI Rights International for more updates on the activities of IPRI. So now we will be having a 20-minute open forum for those that would like to ask questions to our guest speakers and to even to our reactors. So feel free to use the chat feature again to raise your questions. But if you wish to express your sentiments orally, kindly raise your hands through the Zoom feature. Okay, again, we are already calling for an open forum. So if you wish, if you have any questions, you can direct it through the chat box or to the question and answer feature, or you could also raise your hand if you wish to express it orally. Okay, so okay, so okay, we have our first question is from Kamal Rai. So okay, speakers, can you open your videos and decide who will respond to the question. So is there any initiative to resolve the issues in the Philippines? In my understanding, you have Indigenous Council in the Philippines. The systematic um, is being challenged. The systematic is being challenges everywhere. So in Nepal, um, it is also happening. So how can we be proactive to protect and promote indigeneity? We are looking for this Kamal indigenous from Nepal. So from my understanding, so are there any resolve that any agencies in the Philippines or in our country right now uh, in order to respond to the systemic oppression to the indigenous people? So are there any proactive means to protect and promote the indigeneity or to protect and promote the rights of the indigenous people? So for our speakers, feel free to respond. Okay. Speakers, reactors, feel free to respond to the inquiry uh, from UMAHON Central Luzon.
Hello, Prince. Sorry. Can you repeat the question again?
Okay, so a question from Kamal Rai. Basically, she's asking if there are any initiatives to resolve the issues in the Philippines in regard to the case of the indigenous peoples or the oppression that the indigenous peoples are experiencing. So, are there any proactive means to protect and promote the rights of the indigenous peoples? Because from the statement, it's basically sharing as well that that is a systemic concern, not only in the Philippines but also in Nepal.
Okay. Well, Umahon Central Luzon is just our area of responsibility is just in Central Luzon, but I think it's better for April to answer it. But in our organization in Omahon, usually we are trying all our efforts to engage other sectors um, in terms of the fight of our fellow ITAs, the national minority. So particularly, we are trying to reach out the church people, human rights advocates within the area, and actually, well, in fact, we have initiated to form an ecumenical formation within Central Luzon to and we established this ecumenical formation because of the issue of the militarization and the human rights violations of our ITAs in Zambales. So with that, I think it's just an example of type of proactive um, efforts because we're trying to forge a unity to different sectors in order for them to help to support our national minorities. So with that, the good news is that because of the because of the issue of our ITAS, we have gathered different efforts and we have established the PCPR Central Luzon because of the happening in Zambales. So in Omahon, that's just some of the examples of our efforts and campaign plans in protecting and in pursuing in defending the rights of our indigenous.
Okay. Okay. So um, for our next question, for Attorney Cruz, what did the prosecution reason as to why the Lumibaw 4 was charged with anti-terror law instead of murder and homicide?
Yes.
Again, for the question, what
Yeah.
did the prosecution reason as to why the Lumibaw 4 was charged with anti-terror law instead of murder and homicide?
Because they applied instead the anti-terror law because of the death of an army in that encounter. And the definition in section 4A of the law
Uh, yes, Attorney.
section section 4 of Republic Act 11479, this act this particular provision punishes an act wherein in section 4 paragraph A, the way the terrorism is committed by any person who within or outside the Philippines regardless of the states of execution if engages in acts intended to cause death or serious bodily injury to any person or endangers a person's life. So during that time of the said encounter, the one member of the Philippine Army died because of uh, encounter in San Marcelino, Zambales. And that death of the army attributed to the ITAS or the suspect arrested during that time on August 21, 2020. And instead of using the said murder or homicide as defined in the revised penal code, the prosecution used instead this 11479 Republic Act under section 4 paragraph A. That's the basis of the prosecution. Although the said that of the army is part of the engagement or gun battle between the NPA and the Philippine Army troops during that time in San Marcelino. And the Aetas were simply civilians, members of communities who were arrested after the encounter. Actually, the other members of the 9 Aetas arrested, only 4 were charged for this crime attributed to them, and only 2 of the 4 were charged for Republic Act 11479, Section 4, Paragraph A. Hindi ako nadinig.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Attorney Bonifacio. Now, there's a question for our environmental activists. How does the Anti-Terrorism Act impact the work of environmentalists and land defenders? In what ways will this impact the biodiversity of the area and environment in general? Actually, this applies to environmentalists, IP advocates, and etc. So who wishes to answer from the speakers? Maybe Attorney Mai Takeban.
Hello, hi.
Hello. Again, the question from Bernice Beltran is, how does the Anti-Terrorism Act impact the work of environmentalists and land defenders? In what ways will this impact the biodiversity of the area environment in general?
Sige, let me answer that question a bit circuitously. No? If your mental construct is such that you're always on the lookout because whatever you say might be construed as possibly saying something against the government, then that puts a chilling effect on how you think, how you act, how you move forward with advocacies that you want to push forward. You know? A concrete example is the story of Professor Leonard Go. You know? He was quite a distinguished fellow. You know, he was a scientist, but he was also an activist. You know, he was an activist for communities. He was an activist for nature. He was an activist for the environment. But naturalmente, in pushing for the rights of communities and pushing for safeguards of communities, again, as I said earlier, you have certain government projects that prioritizes different things, no? That couches development differently. To put it bluntly, perhaps unsustainably, with extraction and so on. So if you have a policy that permeates, you know, the constructs of what it is to be a citizen, you know, that could define your actions as something other than your intentions, that could very much curtail people's actions, and could very well endanger them, you know, in asserting certain things, you know, in asserting their advocacies. So that is that's the risk with the policies that we have now. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Mai. Okay, so there is a question, I think, Miss from our reactors. I believe she could explain well. Um, is there any clear reason why, instead of addressing the root of terrorism and rebellion, the state simply wages war against people who simply seek fairness and justice? I think Miss Beverly Longid, would you like to respond to this question?
Yeah, thanks, Prince. I think for one, I mean, because that's the kind of state that they are. I mean, they look more into implementing neoliberal policies of privatization, liberalization, and deregulation, and this negatively impacts on indigenous peoples. Second, I think most states, especially in developing countries or the so-called global south, is those in government are also those who are the so-called local elite, and mainly they also have what we call this big or significant economic interest in corporations that are involved in these destructive projects. I mean, take the case of Burma. Most of the generals are involved in mining. Take the case of India. Most of the government, some of the, a significant number of local governments are involved in or have big interest in local corporations that would implement all of these more than 500 or so dams being implemented in indigenous people's territories. And of course, even the UN would come out with studies in relation also to corruption and bribery prevalent in what you call this developing countries. No, I mean, there's no other reason, uh, uh, but that people in government do not really stand for the rights of the people. So I'd like to go back to siguro an earlier question. And connect this to Kamal Rai, and then there's another question in
The first question.
yes, and then why are we saying, do we have evidence that these are happening, or do we have evidence that the human rights situation in the countries that we find ourselves in is worsening? Because of that kind of limitation or challenge that we have to deal with our government, a big challenge or a big part really is within us. How do we assert it? And this can come in various forms. Many of the indigenous communities are already organizing themselves as communities and capacitating themselves to be able to engage governments and to come out with clear policies. One, that would recognize them as indigenous peoples. Two, to push for specific legislations that would protect their rights. Uh, that are already enumerated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Of course, many of it can come in the form of prior informed consent legislation. And of course, also to pressure government to, to do its obligations as far as promoting the human rights of people. Um, Evidences, the reports no, that we have gathered, and even within the latest report of the Human Rights Council and the Human Rights Commissioner itself would indicate a worsening of the human rights situation in the Global South. And this is evidenced by one, we have legislations that are being implemented that further curtails on the people's right to free speech and association. And two, there's evidence of impunity as far as prosecuting human rights violators, especially if these are government officials or state security forces. I mean, take the case of the Philippines. Meron na ba? I mean, do we have really an example? I mean, speak of COVID protocols na lang, no? Ordinary people were jailed for violating COVID protocols. But we had now the chief of police, Sinas, the bold Sinas, who violated this protocol. And what did they do? He was even promoted as the chief police. No? And third, the figures also speak for themselves. You know? Although one killing is one killing too many. You know? It's an increasing number of cases, and then sad to say, of all of these cases being documented, none really have been prosecuted by government, and probably because of the state forces are involved, probably the numbers also are not really speak of how many victims, no, because this might not be necessarily documented. And then, I mean, we can look at the reports, no, in surveys and in studies. And third, yung probably the challenge kasi of how do we look at civil society? How do we look at people's movements and people's organizations? In most cases, we are not recognized as partners in development. Therefore, we are not included in the narratives, in the discussions, or even in the mechanisms where these are being discussed lang, especially if it impacts on indigenous peoples. Kaya I think it will still be crucial recognition so that we'll be able to join. But at the same time, a level of assertion from the part of indigenous peoples.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Beverly, for answering two questions actually. So we will be answering two questions. So first is from David Makatangay, and also April Joy Tobias has been raising her hand, so we will also respond to her inquiry. Okay, so first with David Marik Makatangay, with regard to the land grabbing issues of ITAS, in a webinar conducted by NRCP during the National Science and Technology Week 2019, Dr. Lourdes Cruz, national scientist, asked the BCDA speaker how the agency addresses the issues of the ITAs losing their land. The BCDA speaker responded that the ITAs were asked to show proof or document of their claim before action should be taken. Do ITAs have such a document? Okay, I think that's an interesting question. Um, Goes back to uh, our call for the right to self-determination, and also the policies that defeats the call of the indigenous peoples for the respect to self-determination. I think um, our speaker from UMAHON Central Luzon, Miss Gia, can respond to this.
Hello? Hello? Hello,
Hello.
Mr. Pin. Can you please repeat again the question? Sorry.
Okay, okay. Okay, so with regard to the land grabbing issue in AITA, a seminar conducted by NCRP during the National Science and Technology Week of 2019, Dr. Lourdes Cruz, national scientist, asked the BCDA speaker how the agency addresses the issue of the ITAs losing their land. The BCDA speaker responded that the ITAs were asked to show proof or document of their claim before the action. So, does ITAs have such a document?
Okay, actually, that's indeed a very good question. Our fellow ITAs, we believe that actually they believe, no? They don't need to prove a piece of paper is not just uh, a legal base, a justifiable basis for them to defend their land, their rights to their land, or to their ancestral domain. As what I have said and discussed in my presentation, uh, wait, as what I have said and discussed a while ago, the indigenous people in the Philippines, well, and the Aita in Central Luzon, actually they are the very first person, the very indigenous group in the country. So you see, they don't need a piece of paper just to defend their legality of their land rights. Well, actually, the BCDA in Pampanga, in Florida Blanca, actually they are the main perpetrator of different ecotourism projects. No, they're disguising this kind of project just to continue the plunder and destruction of the ancestral domain of the Aita in the community. And actually, I want to quote, actually in Filipino to, di ba? Yung isang sikat, tama ba Mr. Prince? Sino nga yun? Yung isang sikat na leader na katutubo sa Cordillera na
Makligdulag.
yeah, oh yeah, exactly. No, someone from the government ask him kung nasaan yung lupa, nasaan ang katibayan mo na ikaw ang nagmamay-ari ng lupa. 'Di ba? Ang sabi niya lang naman ay papaano mo mapapamayarian yung isang bagay na matagal nang nandyan bago ka pa dumating. So, ganoon din yung mga katutubong Aita natin sa Central Luzon. Hindi nila kailangan, actually wala nga silang wala silang konsepto ng private ownership. Para sa kanila, ang lahat ng nakikita nilang lupaing ninuno ay kabahagi yon ng buong katutubo at at pinagyayaman nila yon. So, yung simpleng papel, simpleng ay minsan yan pang nagiging entry point o nagiging justifiable grounds ng estado para makamkam, mapalayas yung ating mga katutubong Aita sa kanilang lupaing ninuno.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, Prince. Can I just add to that?
Okay. Yes po.
Well, I think in the case of the Aitas, or in fact many of the indigenous peoples in the Philippines, we do not have land titles to speak of, no? Kasi for one, these are not registered lands, no? Second, the concept of ownership for indigenous peoples and the state is different. As we have mentioned, that's why we are very clear in mentioning that these are ancestral lands, because
Sorry, Miss Beverly.
ano nangyari? Okay.
Sorry.
I was unmuted.
Sorry.
Oh, am I okay now?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Sige. So as I mentioned, most of indigenous peoples do not have paper titles to speak of. Two, the concept of ownership, use, and management of ancestral lands are different between the indigenous peoples and the state. And third, supposedly, the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act, through its provision of certificate of ancestral land or ancestral domain title, should answer to that. But then, ang nangyayari, the process, the burden of proof is with indigenous peoples, and the process is circuitous, the process is expensive, that many of our indigenous communities cannot afford. And in documented cases of those who were able to avail of this certificate, I would agree that this has led to more privatization of and plunder of ancestral land rights of indigenous peoples territories. Kaya yung the question of BCDA, I mean, that's quite arrogant to demand and to say that it is the project and the dislocation of indigenous peoples from the said lands that they are occupying will continue because in the absence of a paper title. So much of the challenge really is for indigenous peoples to be able to assert this rights with or without the documents. And then, of course, if they choose to follow the process of government, to have titles to speak of, that will also be respected. But then, our experience, since how many years of the implementation of this Indigenous Peoples' Rights Law is not really very encouraging.
Okay. Thank you, Miss Beverly Long. Now for our last question. Again, we apologize for extending for 20 minutes. We'll finish now. But for our last question, Miss April Joy Tobias, you'd like to speak? Hello? Oh, okay. Okay. Miss April Joy Tobias, would you like to speak? Okay. Anyway, so yes. I guess this ends our webinar for today. So, but before anything else, to express our solidarity with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, not only in San Marcelino, but in the rest of the Philippine archipelago, and most especially the Lumibao 4, we invite you to raise your calls or post them on social media. For our panelists, kindly open your video to raise your calls. A representative from IPRI will take photos of us. So thank you very much for our speakers. Panelists, panelists, kindly turn on your videos. Thank you. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So, Sir Ivan, kindly take a photo of us together for the panelists. For our audience and participants, kindly respond on your kindly post or publish your take on the webinar that you listened to earlier, especially on the case of the Lumibao 4 and also the rest of our Indigenous Aetas in San Marcelino, Zambales, and the Indigenous people around the Philippines and around the world. Okay. Okay, so for our panelists, kindly open your video. Okay. Okay. Okay, thank you very much again to our audience and to our guests, to our speakers, to our reactors, and to the EPRI staff for our successful webinar. I hope that our um, audience will be able to support us throughout in really struggling with the Aitas of San Marcelino, with the Lumibao 4 and the rest of the indigenous peoples, not only in the Philippines but around the world. Again, thank you very much.